Keep this graphic in mind. This is what I think is the big problem going on, is everybody's focusing on the tip of the iceberg above the water, but that's not really what we're here talking about. What I want to do, I'm the professional optimist here. I'm going to make the argument that it's not completely dead. But so let me start with a state of play, and then I want to structure thinking about what comes next in an optimistic way. So the state of play, I think, is fairly easy. Basically, there's one nation who can't do a low ambition round, one nation that can't do a high ambition round. Basically, US versus China, although, as always in these things, there's bunches of countries hiding behind each of the culprits. The US is really the linchpin, because if the US accepts more moderate increases in ambition, we would be done. It would be very difficult not to go forward. So ultimately, the question is, will the US accept a moderate increase from the December 2008 package or not? That's in Obama's power. That's the way I view it. Most people view the round as almost dead. Basically, in Geneva, people are writing the obituaries. Everybody's starting to think about what's next. I think there's still some glimmer of hope, and I want to talk about the arguments that we should be making to the US in particular, but also the Chinese, to perhaps turn that glimmer into reality. This is the outline of how I think we have to think about what comes next. We really have three action phases facing us. Every country in the world has to face these. First of all, before the 28th of April, actually, I heard today is the 29th of April, is the next informal trade negotiating committee, which is when they will declare dead or not, basically. Or they'll come up with some face-saving thing. So that all the texts will be delivered the 21st of April. Then there'll be a little bit of reflection. Lamy will hold a trade negotiating committee on the 29th, and then we'll know. This is time for last hope arguments, although my spell checker kept turning that into lost hope arguments. I don't know if that was something in the bug in the computer. I don't know. Virus, probably. Phase 2, if it is suspended, as most likely it is, we'll have between May 2010 and April about 2013 of downtime. And we have to think about what to do with that. Phase 3 is post-2013, which is the next window, and we have to think about what to do that. As a good economist, I always think backwards. You start with the end game and move forward. Let's start with Phase 3. Talking to many people, we have to decide whether in Phase 3 we're going to be in an omelet world or a Humpty Dumpty world. The omelet world, you have to break eggs in order to make an omelet. And there are some people out there that think the WTO needs to be broken up in order to make something wonderful. I was talking with Fred Bergstein 2 weeks ago, and he definitely thinks that the WTO is broken. If it fell down, it would be messy to resurrect it, but the phoenix would be better. Jim Rollo recently was writing that the WTO is sort of fundamentally misorganized, and a big crisis would be good for it. There are some people who think we are in the omelet world where it needs to be broken. There's also people like myself who believe we're in the Humpty Dumpty world, whereas if this egg falls off the wall, all the king's men and all the king's horses will never be able to put it back together again. So if it's omelet, all we need is a crisis, many years, and abundant prayer to make sure that this thing doesn't slip off into a 19th century great powers conflict, and trade ends up being as difficult as climate cooperation, for more or less the same reasons. If it's a Humpty Dumpty world, we can't let the WTO fall off the wall, and that has lots of implications for what we do in Phase 1 and Phase 2. In Phase 3, however, it means we're going to have to relaunch the round. But we know this one doesn't work. So we'll have to do DDA, Doha Development Agenda, plus some red meat for China. Because basically, China is saying, what's in it for me? My exports are growing, what, 20% a year for the last decade and a half? What is in there for them? So if you're going to get the deal done, there must be something in the agenda that is of interest to Brazil, India, and China that isn't already there. Either way, the deal is not likely for this decade, because it would take 2 or 3 years to negotiate the new agenda. It would take several years to negotiate the deal, so we're not looking till 2020 to the next deal. One critical point, which should be stressed repeatedly to the Americans, is that this kind of cozy G20 Seoul November 2010 deal, where they all get together and decide this time it's for real, That won't work in 2013 because the US negotiating tactics have ruined the goodwill. The way they've gone about this, many people suspect that they never were negotiating in good faith to begin with, and therefore kind of a cozy thing, we're just going to relaunch the round exactly as it is, will have no credibility among the G20 leaders in April 2013. Step back. So we don't know whether we're in the omelet world or the Humpty Dumpty world, but if it's the omelet world, all we need is prayer. Praying may actually help, because in order to make this work, they have to think, especially Brazil, India, China, have to think this is a terrible world without the WTO. Therefore, they have to be all on board of reconstructing a new WTO where they take more of a leadership position. If we're in the Humpty Dumpty world, we're going to need some reflection on what red meat needs to be added to the agenda. But in either case, I think it's important in the meantime to drive home the changed nature of trade, because many of our leaders are thinking about the world of trade as it was in the 1970s, not the world of trade where trade, investment, and services are all of a part. International commerce is now a complex thing, and negotiating tariffs is just the easiest bit of the whole thing. One way of saying this is China's US's new Saudi Arabia, but on industrial inputs. One of the reasons US had so much trouble with the Chinese exchange rates is because US industry would not let them go to trade war with China, because that's where they're buying their oil, so to speak, their industrial inputs. And we also have to realize the true threat of the 21st century regionalism submerging, because if this gets suspended, the RTAs will take to the front, and we have to worry about how that world's going to work out. Up to phase one, the last hope arguments. Here are the best I could do for the US. We have to do the DDA because, first of all, we have to lock China into something. Just like after 73, Saudi Arabia had to become our friends, and we locked them into alliances by selling them arms, this and that. I switched back and forth between my Swiss passport and American passport here. So, lock China into something. They're not locked into in a leadership role in a responsible way in the IMF, or the Security Council, or on climate change, or the World Bank. But if DDA gets done, they will be leaders in a multinational organization, and that's the step towards making China a responsible player in line with their economic weight. Second point, this is probably the best access that the US is going to get to Brazil, India, China this decade. Because as we went through stage 3, one way or another, Doha, or its Doha Plus, is not going to finish before 2010. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is getting everybody excited in Washington now, that's a pipe dream for 2 reasons. Obama's domestic base will not let him sign free trade agreements with Vietnam and the Philippines. Certainly not during an election campaign, probably not even after that. And the idea that TPP would force China and India to bend to American will, as APEC did at the close of the Uruguay round, that's what they're thinking, competitive liberalization, is wrong, because this kind of 21st century regionalism is not as discriminatory as the old one. FTAs are also a bit of a pipe dream, so if the US wants better access to these markets, they have to do this deal. Third, there are people in the US who are huge China bashers, who want to go trade wars with China. There are other people in the US government who are against that. Finishing Doha would show China would be somebody who can deal business, and that would dampen the enthusiasm of the China bashers. Also, the United States, probably no matter what happens, is slipping into aggressive unilateralism, viewing, especially if Doha suspends, the way to get what American business needs is by threatening bilateral retaliation, as they did in 1970 against Germany with the Nixon tariffs, as they did in 1980 with Japan with Plaza Accord and the Structural Impediments Initiative. And lastly, to save the dispute settlement mechanism. That's a bit of a complicated argument, and we have one of the greatest trade lawyers in the world, so I'll skip that. For China, one word, harmony. Now, I had lunch with the Taiwanese ambassador earlier this week, and he told me that Chinese, you always know you're on slippery ground when the Chinese start talking about what the characters mean. But he told me that harmony and compromise were the same symbol in Chinese. So that's basically, You have to convince the Chinese that they have to give something to avoid this aggressive unilateralism, to avoid this China bashing, and it doesn't have to be very much. So I just leave you with this thought that what everybody is focusing on, especially the American administration, is the export gains, which is the tip of the iceberg. What they should be worrying about is the systemic losses of not finishing Doha, the stuff underneath there. I'll just leave you with a little advert from my favorite website. There's also advertisements in the back.